We've been discussing for a very extended period of time the soul and the body, that the body is made of earth, and it is a representation of the material, the physical, earthiness, darkness, which due to its physical makeup, it's inclined to everything which is the antithesis of spirituality, and the soul, which is an entity of holiness, which is the spiritual component in a human being. And there's nothing comparable in creation to what the soul is, even greater than the greatest angel. And the soul itself, we're speaking about specifically the Jewish soul. The Jewish soul is a different dimension than the non-Jewish soul. And that's the reason why, to perfect it, it requires 248 positive commandments and 365 negative commandments. The non-Jewish soul is only bound by the 7 Noahide laws because it's a different reality of what its purpose, what its value is. The soul itself emanates from God's illumination. It represents everything which has relevance to the infinite, which is God's being. The physical, the material, represents the ultimate limitation. Finite in the most exaggerated level of limitation. However, God created the body in a way that it has a capacity to be influenced by the soul. Now, why does the soul represent illumination? Because God wills that entity should be an expression of his own unlimited illumination. It should reflect that. That's the reason why it has that illumination. Because God wills an energy to that soul to reflect his own being. The body, on the other hand, has the least amount of illumination. Therefore, it's earthy, it's dark. It's inclined to things which have no relevance to God, like the animal. The animal is the animal, limited to the physicality. It's born, it dies. That's the extent of its existence. A human being, when the person dies, the body may wither, but the soul continues. Because the soul is a different dimension of existence. It's an expression of God's illumination. And therefore it continues. But because the soul has that innate makeup due to God's illumination, it has the ability to illuminate, which we call spiritualization, to impact the physicality of the body, that it should also be illuminated, that if it connects and it has the dominating position over the body and it utilizes it to facilitate the purpose of the soul, then it has the capacity to be illuminated, to be spiritualized. But God, only because God created it to have that capacity. I'll give you an example. You have a deflated balloon. You blow air into it, it expands. But it's only because it has that capacity to expand. Otherwise, you couldn't. You have something which has, in terms of its makeup, it has absorption. You put something onto it, it absorbs. The body is earthy, but it has a capacity to absorb the spirituality of the soul, to receive an infusion of the soul. It can be infused. So it only functions in the capacity, in this deficient level, if it's not enriched. But the physical body has an absorption capacity that it could absorb the spirituality of the soul if it's utilized with the objective to facilitate the objective of the soul, which is the Torah and the mitzvos. Because that itself are the mediums through which the soul itself is spiritualized and advanced. And the soul cannot advance unless it has the body to be the medium to assist it to achieve that. So we have this composite. If the physical composite component participates in the advancement, meaning it's a means, it's not an end, then it's spiritualized, but it has a capacity to be spiritualized. If not, it remains that earthy body representing everything negative. And not only that, if it's not utilized by the soul itself becomes absorbed into the body and doesn't provide any level of illumination. And the soul becomes ineffective and becomes non-functional as the soul what it's meant to function as. And the person lives as an intellectual animal without any level of spiritualization. We find, as I mentioned, there are attributes of God. There's the attribute of chesed, indiscriminate kindness. There's the attribute of justice. There's the attribute of mercy. All these attributes really have nothing to do with God's essence. It's only the way God relates to this world. For the world to function, you have to have the attribute. God has to interact within the context of indiscriminate kindness. For the world to function, God has to interact with this world with the attribute of justice, with the attribute of mercy. But it's not a reflection of God's essence. We speak about the verses, it says, the eyes of God, the hand of God. God has no eyes, he has no hand. God is the totality of everything. So what does it mean, the eyes? The right hand of God, the left hand of God. The Talmud tells us that the right always represents the attribute of mercy. Left is something negative, represents the attribute of justice. Therefore, when we do a mitzvah, excuse me, a right-handed person does the mitzvah with his right hand. Because since the mitzvah represents something positive, you do it with the right. Because right represents the positive. Left represents negative. It's like you say to a person, "No, you've given me a left-handed compliment." Because the left represents negative. You know, it's known in Europe, especially in Germany, children that wrote with their left hands, which were naturally lefty, they were forced and they conditioned them to write with their right hand. Because being a lefty was considered like some kind of handicapped. You're a handicapped person, even though it has to do with the brain. If you're a righty or you're a lefty, a person can be born ambidextrous, which you're able to use either hand as the other. But usually one favors one hand over the other. But the left always represents negative, more exacting, more consequential in the negative. The right is something mercy, kindness, softness. As the Talmud says, that you embrace with the right and you push away with the left. Meaning the way you discipline a person and give a person understanding to an appreciation of good, simultaneously understands that there's a disciplinary aspect simultaneously that if you misbehave, the left will push you away. So the left represents distance, the right represents drawing closer. That's what it represents. God, in terms of the prophet sees God in a form when he has his vision. He could be seen as an elderly sage, as a warrior. But that's only the way God is related to existence. His right hand outstretched, his left hand outstretched. But all this is only the way God is related to existence. The reason why a person is born with two eyes and two hands and two arms and two legs is because God relates to existence. God sees. Because God sees the human being created in the image of God, that person is a representation of God, the way God relates to existence. God has in the vision of the prophet, the way he relates to this existence the outstretched hand of God, as we see about the plagues that came upon Egypt, the powerful hand of God. God knows. So all the parts of the body correspond to various relationships that God has with this existence, for this existence to function. The human being the center of existence, being so-called the epitome and the essence of creation, and everything was created only to accommodate him. As God is the king of the universe, the human being is the king of existence. The world was created to accommodate him, his purpose. The human being is endowed with intelligence to be able to control existence, not that existence should control him. As we said, the might and the physicality of an animal, the human being cannot match that. But through the ingenuity of a human being, being an intelligent being, you're able to use that intellect to be able to control and take charge and trap and utilize the physical and utilize the power of existence. You know, the concept of a fulcrum, using the gravity, various things. We use gravity to be able to what? To advance ourselves. I mean, the whole concept of winnowing. The farmer, after he threshes the wheat, takes it, and when the wind is blowing, he throws it up into the wind. He uses the wind to separate between the chaff and the kernel. So the human being, through his ingenuity, understands how to use existence, the power of existence, and the force of existence in a creative, productive way. We talk about thermal energy, using the sun, or whatever it may be, different crops. We understand the values of the elements of existence, the seasons. The Talmud tells us that in ancient days, there were people, in terms of agriculturists, they were able to pick up a piece of earth and smell it. And just by smelling, they knew exactly what has to be planted there. They had senses. They were so in touch with the physical makeup of existence, they knew exactly how to utilize the physicality of the world, how to plant it, and how to reap it, and how to maximize on whatever its values are. That's the human being. The human being is endowed with many characteristics which mimic God's. It's only a manifestation of God's involvement in this existence. As I said, the eyes, the hands, God speaks. You know, the mouth of God. God has no mouth. But again, the way he relates to this existence within the way the prophet sees his relationship, it's as if, because that's the way it manifests the connection, the human being speaks. The human being has a mouth, we speak. This is the understanding. A person has the capacity, the ability, that we're able to spiritualize our physicality to a point where literally it nearly take on the characteristics of the soul to such a degree. Moshe Rabbeinu was able to achieve that level. That his physicality, although is physical, but its dimension and its value was similar to his soul because he totally spiritualized it. But nevertheless, it still retained a physical characteristic, and that's why he had to die. At the end of time, after resurrection, the physicality will take on the full value of the soul. It'll be integrated to the degree where the soul will subsume the physicality of existence, that the physicality will be totally spiritualized at the same level as the soul. Give you an interesting comparable situation. The law is that if you have non-kosher falling into kosher, and you have a sufficient ratio between the majority and the minority, you're permitted to eat the full mixture, although contained within that mixture, you have something non-kosher. Give you an example. You have meat, a pot of meat, and you have milk falls into that pot. The Jew is not permitted to eat milk and meat. But if the dilution is sufficient, 60-1, that's the ratio between that. The milk is subsumed by the meat, and as if the milk doesn't exist in that meat. And you're permitted to eat it. So the milk takes on the characteristics of the meat. Although you're eating milk and meat, in terms of the traces are there, but it has no value because it's been subsumed by the majority. The word is subsuming. When it's subsumed, it doesn't exist. Ultimately, at the end of time, after resurrection, the intensity of the illumination of the soul will be so powerful, it will totally vaporize or absorb the physicality of existence into itself to spiritualize it. There won't be a trace of that physicality. That will be the degree that it will be spiritualized. There won't be a trace. Today, at best, you can't go beyond Moshe Rabbeinu. He was a physical being. He radiated to the point you couldn't even look at him. That was the intensity of his radiance. But he still retained his physical persona in terms of he's finite. Ultimately, the physical becomes infinite, eternal. Because of the degree, as the soul is eternal, the body assumes all the characteristics of the soul, because the illumination of the soul will subsume it, and therefore takes on all its characteristics for that reason. Now, why does a person crave everything which is naturally something which is the antithesis of spirituality? The body itself, in its own right, if you allow it to continue in its own right, where it should be advanced and it doesn't advance, it craves more of the physical. That means evil is allowed to fester there. If the body itself or the world itself is not infused with spirituality, the evil advances itself and has the upper hand. Evil breeds evil. So the body, the physicality of the body, inclination-wise, is everything negative. We lust, power. Power means suppression of others. Everything which is something which represents only the physical. And that's the whole concept of Amalek, the Amalekites, that ultimately they cannot tolerate the existence of the Jewish people because it's not something conscious. It's not a conscious thing. They, based on, it's like a person has an allergic reaction to something. You don't even know why, but because of what you represent and what we represent, the Amalekites versus the Jewish people, we represent the ultimate in spirituality. This is a threat. This itself cannot coexist with evil. Something has to give. Either evil gets the upper hand and it tries to totally eradicate the good, or the good gets the upper hand and it subsumes and negates the evil and incapacitates the evil. And that's the tug war throughout history. The rise and fall of the Jewish people. The times where if God would allow them to destroy us, we'd be destroyed. But since God entered into a covenant with the Jewish people, that the Jewish people are eternal, although we may have serious setbacks and casualties, but a full annihilation never will be, because we are eternal, we are God's people. But numbers will be diminished very seriously. The Holocaust, it was up to Hitler, Yimach Shmo V'Zichro, who's a manifestation of Amalek. he wouldn't have left one surviving Jew on this planet. I was just reading when the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, they went into Brisk. Brisk was the community of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. That was his community. It was then it was in Poland. Today it's part of Belarus. It's called Brest-Litovsk in White Russia. When they came in, there were 20,000 Jews. After the war, there were 4 survivors of the 20,000 Jews. They went and hunted the Jews and murdered men, women, and children that you can't believe. The rabbi, who was somebody one of a kind, he was a decider. He was one of the greatest Torah sages of the generation, pre-World War II. He was a man already in his upper 70s. The first thing they did, they grabbed him, and he had a presence of a holy rabbi, and they cut off his beard, and they cut off the side locks. Wasn't a Hasidic Jew. And after they did that, they said, you have to pay us. We gave you a haircut. He had no money, took everything. They started to beat him. They beat him like a dog. And then they took the 75-year-old man and they take him to a staircase and they throw him down the steps. Then he breaks every rib in his body. And they're laughing and they're gloating over this. It was done. It wasn't just they killed the Jews. It was with a vengeance, with a hate, with an intolerance of whatever we represent. It was with a demonic madness. That's how they destroyed the Jews. They could not tolerate the existence of the Jew. Innocent children, people are invalids, didn't make a difference. They went with machine guns and just machine gunned them, either mass graves or in their homes. And then they burnt the buildings down and they incinerated them. It's inhumane. They didn't want there should be a vestige of that. But that's the tug of war between good and evil. But as much as they wanted and they attempted to do that, the Jews had a regeneration. We regenerated. Today, the amount of Torah in the world, the families, they had families one time, 4 children, 3 children, 2 children. They have families, 8, 10, 12 children in the religious community. And they're educated appropriately, Jewishly, learn it. God allowed it. Despite what they tried to bring about, but because the core that was left was a very special core. And that core went and took the bull by its horns and made endless sacrifices. And it was like a triage. All we have to focus now is on rebuilding the Jewish people, reestablishing Jewish institutions, Jewish education. All this. Post-World War II in the United States, what was an observant Jew? Not a learned Jew, not learned. At best, he was a Sabbath observer. I'm using the word Sabbath observer. What was kosher? Kosher means if you read on the ingredient, it didn't say lard. That meant kosher. What did people know? Kosher, not kosher. They knew it had to be ritually slaughtered. Was it properly ritually slaughtered? They said it was. Was it? Nobody knew. The levels of supervision were literally very backward. Only after the war, when the more learned people came from Europe, the survivors, and they were learned, they knew what standards were. New standards were set in the United States for Judaism. What is kosher? What's not kosher? What's ritual slaughter? What's not ritual slaughter? What will be tolerated? What will not be tolerated? Who's qualified to be a teacher, to teach in a Jewish school? I had a teacher when I went to school, my 4th grade teacher. He wasn't even a Shomer Shabbos. Could you imagine? He taught me Hebrew subjects in a yeshiva, and he was not a Shomer Shabbos, the man. Could you imagine? We didn't know, but that was a fact. So what could have the quality of that Jewish education been? Beyond cultural. Today, it's impossible to have such a thing, unless it's a cultural school. But if it's a Torah school, you can't teach in Harvard unless you have a certain type of level of education. You're not qualified to teach in that kind of yeshiva unless you have that quality of education, plus being a person of certain beliefs and certain commitment to the religion. You don't qualify. Meir Kahane, he used to say, he started the Jewish Defense League in the United States. He used to say, never again. That was his call to action. What happened in the Holocaust, he said, never again, God forbid. Never again. Rav Shach, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha, he took issue with that motto of never again. We pray to God never again. We pray. But do we have control over society? We have no control. Do we have control of anti-Semitism? As much as we believe that we could put a cap on it, when it starts rearing its head, maybe 30 years ago, they started to build all these Holocaust centers throughout the United States. New York City, Texas, all over, these Holocaust memorial centers, because we have to teach the non-Jews what the Holocaust was, and therefore there'll be a different level of relationship between the non-Jew and the Jew. Appreciate the inhumanity of the Holocaust. The level of anti-Semitism today in the United States has quadrupled from year to year. It just keeps rising. The incidence of anti-Semitism in the United States, and they're going from bad to worse. But we're advancing ourselves. We're becoming more humane. We're more merciful. We're more giving. The Jews haven't stopped giving. So why? The answer is, you understand, the one who determines more or less is not up to us. That's the tug of war between good and evil. Despite everything, as good as you think you are, evidently there's some aspect of our Judaism which is not being addressed, and therefore we don't merit that divine protection sufficiently. So therefore, at one time in the United States, there was no safer location in the world as the United States for a Jew. Opportunity-wise, safety-wise, every-wise, education-wise, religion-wise, freedom of religion. In God we trust. Honesty, everything. Today, unfortunately, it's becoming history, many of these things. That pride, they pride themselves in these genuine positive values, ethics and the morals. It's not there anymore. It's going. It's fading out. Why? The world at large, the level of conscience of what they did to the Jew, even today in Europe. Anti-Sem, why? That's the expression of evil. Evil is rearing its head, because when evil gets the upper hand, evil wants to, as holiness subsumes evil. Evil, God forbid, could subsume holiness, but it can't subsume it because God has a covenant with the Jewish people will never become extinct, ever. There will always be a resurgence, and ultimately evil will be destroyed. When God will choose that moment where the whole world will recognize that he is the omnipotent being and nothing exists out of him, outside of himself. But this has been going on since time immemorial between the good and the evil, especially since Sinai, where we reached the pinnacle of that and we were chosen to represent good in existence because we became the Adam pre-sin when we received the Torah at Sinai. Rambam writes, today you have Jews that are self-hating Jews. What is this all about? So Rambam, who was a doctor, the greatest physician, Maimonides, he writes, as you have physical ailments, when a person is physically not well, he has deficiencies, he craves things which are literally detrimental to him. He says a person has, due to certain deficiencies, he craves to eat clay, which is inedible, to eat carbon. He tastes something sweet, to him sweet is bitter or sour. Sour is sweet. Why? Because there's a certain malfunction in the body and therefore craves things which are detrimental to it. But that's only indication of illness in the body. He says a person who cannot tolerate spirituality, his soul is sick. Just as the body, when it's deficient and it's ailing, it cannot tolerate something which is positive and beneficial, identically, a person who cannot tolerate spirituality, especially a Jew, he is sick, his soul is sick. And because his soul is sick, he cannot tolerate. He sees another Jew behaving as an observant Jew, doing a mitzvah. He wants to eradicate it. So what the self-hating Jews are, they've reached almost the lowest point, almost a detachment of anything spiritual. And this is that expression of the intolerance of something which represents God. We've had enough of that. The atheists. You have Jews. I don't get in, who during the Nazi era, they were informers on Jews. And some of these people today, they're in their 90s, close to 90, they're funding all the left movements in the United States. And he's a European Jew. And his son, he mentored his son to do the same. This is evil. But that's a manifestation of that because the man has a sick soul. The soul is dying, and when it dies, it demonstrates and expresses every level of the antithesis of what spirituality is about and wants to uproot it and eradicate it.